More agile evaluation ex post, so a lot of emphasis on getting hold of and having access to better data sets more rapidly. Some discussion about the importance for researchers of helping policymakers understand the logic that underlies policies, so understanding the mechanism or the plausible mechanisms of why something might work as an essential part of then going away and doing a better evaluation than you would otherwise. So trying to get inside the mind map or the mental processes of the policymaker. It's a fairly scary process to my mind, but apparently some people do it. And then finally, and in a sense implicit in much of what's on that slide, is this idea that we've got to change the reward system in universities because, to some extent on the supply side, we're pushing up against all kinds of other incentive structures that move in the opposite direction. So the UK Research Excellence Framework, which is the 5-yearly assessment of the quality of research in British universities, is about to take place, and we know that 20% of the marks, if you like, on the test for universities will be given to real world impact. So that's impacts outside the academic world. But I guess a lot of policymakers were saying about bloody time too, and we should have less focus on grant writing and producing dull original research papers in uncited journals. So that's the sort of supply side picture that we've seen, but it goes on. I mean, this is a major industry. So on the demand side, and I think this is where it probably gets more interesting, at least from my point of view, a whole lot of proposals. This is largely the sort of proposals that are around ex-ante evaluation. So that we've got to raise the absorptive capacity of policy organisations by giving them new characteristics, I suppose you might say. This is just a selection of the ideas people have come up with. More permeable boundaries, stronger external networks with researchers and others, stronger organisational memory, so the idea that, again, if you're going to do this rapid synthesis and pay people to do it, you should actually be able to find it 18 months later, which is a challenge in many modern bureaucracies because they're organised around project teams and sort of the passing, and they're supposed to be agile and flexible organisations, which means they don't have a filing system. And again, there's expertise in foresight and other such things that would help make the organisation more susceptible, if you like, or able to commission and appropriately use evaluation. And I think, again, of most interest to me, a whole lot of discussion about how does the policy process itself inhibit or support the better value of evaluation. So lots of ideas about opening up, making more transparent and more rigorous policy development processes, encouraging early engagement of policy advisors with researchers. So that's really where my research unit sits in this world. So techniques like the red teaming idea from the defence or the military, where you kind of in a confidential environment, you get experts in to try and destroy your policy before you implement it in case it induces high casualty rates. So something from the military spreading out into wider public policy. And then if you like the opposite, the citizens' jury, the idea that you bring all the research evidence and you call for evaluation and evidence to be brought to bear in a public sphere, where in a sense the public helps improve the quality of the process. These are all, if you like, relatively indirect ways over the long term of increasing the demand for evaluation, because you can't have a very good citizens' jury if you haven't got a good body of knowledge that you can put in front of the jury. And so on. So, the idea that if we level the playing field between interest groups, this will allow a wider range of voices to be heard and a wide range of evidence, and that in turn will stimulate demand for more and better evaluation. And finally, a kind of set of requirements that placed on government, which I think I mentioned in that original quote, that if government's required to explain the reasons for its decisions, especially when they might be contrary to or a particular interpretation of scientific advice, if you require that to be stated, then again, in the longer term, they'll have to find the evidence to actually be able to make those kind of statements, so they can sort of differentiate between where they're using
scientific knowledge and where they're quite legitimately adding in the particular values of the government of the day. So again, some of these things are demand-side proposals that take some time to fit through. Others are much, much more sort of immediate, short-term, obvious. So there's been a lot of writing
around the world about this. Can you put in organisational or institutional arrangements that actually generate constant demand for evidence and locate them in key places in the policy system? And the one that's often used as a kind of shorthand for this is this notion of this organisation called NICE, which is a National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, which in England and Wales, among its roles, one of its key roles is to provide definitive advice to the NHS about which new drugs and treatments and devices and procedures should be used and paid for by the NHS. It provides also a lot of guidance and guidelines and advice to the professional communities. And essentially the attraction here for the folks who want to improve the quality of policy evaluation is to say, well, why don't we have such a thing in other spheres? Why do we just apply it to health policy? In fact, it's only really the new stuff in health policy. What's the thought experiment? What if we had a NICE for social policy in general, or criminal policy, or penal policy, or education policy? What would it look like? So we've had a lot of discussion within Britain about this, but also I noticed a number of places around the world people have picked up this idea, and NICE has now got an international division which exports the NICE model to other countries in the health field. I suspect it's moving into exporting the idea to other areas of social policy. So the Civil Service Reform Plan talks about, again, it mentions the possibility, what about across all of health and social policy, an organisation to test and trial approaches to what works. So it's very much in that sort of modernist, rationalist tradition. Another version of it, through this Alliance for Useful Evidence, the notion of an independent body linking the supply and demand for evidence together. So there's some interest in something called independence here, not quite sure. NICE is a health authority, so it's like a kind of an additional district health board. If it was in New Zealand, it would be the 21st District Health Board. And it says it is at arm's length from ministers, although it has part of its workload is negotiated with the Minister of the day. Another idea, which is from Institute for Government, slightly different, a body separate from all government departments to commission evaluations of their policies. So the Ministry of Education would have its policies evaluated by an independent body, and it would also at the same time assess the quality of departments' own internal evaluations of their own policies. So it would act as a kind of peer reviewer or a black hat or a kind of treasury for evaluation, I suppose. It would be fairly kind of dismal. They would have to take the dismal view really of the sort of self-interested evaluations. And then I think coming out of the sort of macroeconomic policy world, some discussion about some of the models like in the Netherlands and more recently the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK. What if we had an organisation, again, independent of government, perhaps acting on behalf of Parliament, that could undertake ex-ante and ex-post assessments of policy plans, not just around government spending and so on, but actually more widely. And could that be available, for example, to the opposition? Or should that be available to NGOs? Because the Dutch equivalent of the OBR, as I understand it, is available to opposition political parties and to groups of citizens. They can go to this organisation and they can ask if something can be looked at that the government is proposing, to take a different kind of evidence-based approach. So again, these are all ways of demanding more evaluation, that these organisations would be sucking up and wanting more and funding more. And certainly NICE generates a continuous stream of demands for both quite rapid modelling work, but also longer-term ex-post, clinical trials, cost-effectiveness, cost-utility studies of new devices, technologies, new drugs, and provides a lot of pressure onto the National Institute for Health Research to fund research. There's a clear pipeline. They need it to do their business. They have a mandatory role within the system. Can we think about that in a wider sense? Here we go. Yes, we're still going. And again, further thinking around the detail of how policies are justified and documented, I suppose, is the best way of describing this. Sometimes people talk about control, but it may be more to do with just being transparent and being open. But in the UK, all major pieces of legislation come with fairly detailed impact assessment from the relevant government department. which tries to use the evidence available ex ante to say why this policy will work, and includes some rather heroic cost-benefit analysis in many cases. And a number of suggestions have been made really to try and integrate that better with the original business cases that might have been made 3 or 4 years earlier for the particular piece of legislation or the policy change, and to avoid a kind of last-minute post-hoc rationalisation, which many of the people who write these impact assessments will tell you that that's what they do. There's some smiles around the room. On the front page of the current template for UK impact assessments is something called a post-implementation review. There's a little box, and basically what that's supposed to say is if this is a really significant change, some thumbnail description of how in 2 or 3 years' time we're going to know whether we've done what we said we'd do and it has had the impact that we have told the public that it will have. So how do we... And the problem at the moment with those is that they're written, and then there is no wiring that leads to anything else. They're just written. So as long as there's something in the box, if the commitment is over a certain magnitude, if it's a spending commitment, that's fine. But I discovered that in, for example, the Department of Health, there's no one who gathers these up and says, well, what are we going to do? We've got these requests. Here's the demand side for evaluation. So here's a bunch of analysts saying, yep, this is how we think we ought to be following this up in 2 or 3 years' time. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to start commissioning your evaluation the day after the bill's turned into law, because otherwise you won't have the evidence available unless it happens to be something that you can look at through routine administrative data. So again, a lot of ideas about can we make these more real? Can that be a way of generating a research program rather than having separate research prioritization processes that are disconnected from, if you like, the business? Because again, we typically see that our department might have a research committee, it might set some research priorities. But if you actually look what they're doing in any period, the areas that they're involved in are rather different. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, having a different set of priorities, but there needs to be some relationship between what you're legislating for example, what you're advising on, and where you're going to put your evaluation effort. And then this idea, for example, that there should be much stronger incentives for any policy agency to use evidence routinely. And that we would, for example, we could even have a block on the introduction of proposals unless policymakers can show how evidence supports their proposals. And if they use weak evidence, that there might be some appeal perhaps to this independent evaluation entity that would be able to say, well, I'm sorry, the evidence just isn't adequate to bring this in. You need to go away and get some better evidence. Honestly, these things are being suggested by sane and rational people. Select committees of Parliament being given a mandate to do an evidence check on all submissions, so that would be rather similar to this idea that there would be some kind of parliamentary cooling off period or block on proposals that don't pass some kind of evidence check. And the final one, which maybe is a bit peculiar to the UK, but obviously, again, with major policy proposals, departments write risk assessments, quite detailed ones. Should those be routinely published, or are they privileged? Is that the advice between public servants and ministers that should remain in confidence? There was a huge furore. It took about 9 months. The Department of Health refused to publish the risk assessment they'd written for the Secretary of State for Health around the recent NHS changes in England, and as far as I'm aware, they're still not refused to publish it. Possibly because it simply says, Minister, this policy is doomed politically, which of course it was. He lost his job. But others would have a very different view. And the final one is a rather specific one to the methodologists, and I hinted at it before, and that is that there should be much, much greater use, not just of experiments in policy, but randomised controlled trial type experiments. So the behavioural insight team in the Cabinet Office, which is the sort of nudge team, this is the behavioural economics and psychology group, have got the bit between their teeth, and they've written this wonderful paper called Test, Learn, Adapt, and they make some pretty bold statements. RCTs are the best way of determining whether a policy is working. We should and could use RTCs much more extensively in domestic public policy to test the effectiveness of new and existing interventions. And they've got this sort of fairly straightforward process of a sort of fairly linear test, learn, adapt. And it's a kind of short, it's a guide for people who've never seen a randomised controlled trial in their lives. So that's the welter
God, I still haven't. Anyway, there's more. I won't.